right now. Welcome everyone to the AFWERX Fusion afternoon panel. I would love to introduce, well, first of all, let me say my name is Alicia Linehan. I'm coming to you from lovely outside of New Orleans, Louisiana. I will be helping moderate this panel, or this workshop, excuse me. And I'm going to throw it over to Dr. Jeff Degraff, who is the Dean of Innovation at the University of Michigan. So Dr. Degraff, you can take over, and then if y'all have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll have time at the end to go over some of that. And I'm going to start sharing my screen right now.
Okay, thanks, Alicia. Welcome, everyone. What we're going to do is I'm going to take you through about 30 minutes of what I've learned working with basically over half of all the Fortune 500 over the past 35 years in terms of what actually works and what doesn't work. And what we'll do at the end is we'll discuss kind of some of the key learnings and how this applies to the Air Force. Alicia?
Yep, I'm getting there, sorry. There we go, there we go.
So first of all, by what authority am I doing this? Well, I've been in 258 of the Fortune 500 at the very senior level. Lisa, next slide. And I've been in I've had over 2 million frequent flyer miles. So I've been in over 100 countries. So I've got a little combat education here. What's important is when we look at what are the most innovative companies, this comes from Fast Company. There's a real problem with this. So every year since Fast Company has done this, I've been keeping track of how many of these companies are still in existence. And about a third of them either go under or they're acquired by someone else and eliminated. So why do I say that? Because I'm not going to talk about those kind of companies. I'm going to talk about these kind of companies, big companies. Companies that are able to do three things. Number one, they're able to actually harness or harvest exploration, which comes from big research institutions like the one that I teach at, the second largest research institution in the United States. Then there's usually a part about maturation where we make sure that that molecule becomes a basic agent, a basic buffering agent, and that comes from tech transfer, from institutes. And finally, they become applications, things that startups do, things that we see at the very end of the process. But what I want to look at are organizations that are able to do all three things. So they're not lightweights. Now, why is this important? Because for the first time,
sorry, keeps there. There we go. There we go.
For the first time in modern history, we are looking at a peer adversary that does these three things very, very well. And we can have in the discussion what's actually happened with large-scale technology and what's happening in the world of large-scale technology against the Chinese. So let's take a look at what companies get wrong. And I'm going to give you my top 10 list. I'm going to kind of breeze through it to make sure that we've got time to take questions. So put your questions in the chat room. First of all, confusing technology with innovation. I know everyone is in love with Tesla and the autonomous vehicle, which incidentally, the first autonomous vehicle site was here in Ann Arbor. Wonderful stuff. They sold 365,000 cars last year, which means of the world automobile market, of passenger cars, they sold 1%. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at this technology and we look at what percentage, what's happening with passenger cars have had a negative 5% growth rate year over year for the past 5 years. Given COVID and what people are doing at home, what they're figuring out is even in the best of time, your car spends 23 hours and 13 minutes a day parked. So we don't drive our cars very much. During that same period of time, the last 5 years, ride sharing worldwide has gone up 15%. Now, I want you to think about what happens after COVID. When people are in a recession, are they going to buy more cars or less cars? Going to buy less cars? Are they going to want to be in cars with people who have a problem or not have a problem? Well, they'd prefer to be in cars with people who don't have a problem. But what's likely to happen under any scenario is that the car ownership market is going to go down. The big innovation wasn't autonomous vehicles. It was social. It was people getting in the car with a stranger, moving from cars to transportation. So what's happened is we're looking the wrong way. And this happens also in very, very large scale things. Think about, for the last time the United States was attacked, it wasn't attacked with a Sidewinder missile. It was attacked with our own commercial aircraft. And if you remember the 9/11 report, the executive summary in the first paragraph, 9/11 was caused by a failure of imagination, a failure to understand that innovation is more than technology. So what do we need to think about? Does your organization confuse technology with innovation? I'm trained as a technologist. I have a PhD in the area, right? Look beyond technology to other types of innovation, platform solutions, customer experience, process innovation, supply chain, and boy, aren't we seeing that with COVID, so on and so forth. Second one, Coca-Cola Zero, believing you can see the future. I got called in the 90s to look at a failed project at Coca-Cola called C2. It was amazing. If you want to know where the aluminum bottle came from, it came from a joint venture with Coca-Cola and Alcoa. It didn't come from AB InBev. It came from the soda pop people. If you want to know where Truvia came from, or the new type of sweetener, it came from Coca-Cola in a joint venture with Cargill. They developed this little bitty can and this really cute way of marketing everything, and nobody bought it. They did incredible marketing opinion research, one of the best in the world. But the product was a disaster. So what we did was we took the product away and we took it to, I think we got a blank screen here, Alicia.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Something's going wrong here.
Oh, there we go.
Let's see.
There we go. Sorry.
All right. So we took it to Tunisia for the World Cup, and we worked out what we needed to do with it. So we put it back in a plastic bottle. We put NutraSweet back in it. We doubled the amount of caffeine in it. And the trade name that we were using, or the code name, was Coke Zero. And of course, the rest of the story is pretty well known. It worked out pretty well. So what's the key learning? The key learning is, does your organization believe it can see the future? There's no data on the future. I love the Kierkegaard famous quote, you know, life can only be understood looking backwards, but it must be lived forward, right? So run smaller, faster, and wider array of experiments to accelerate the failure cycle. Failure is inevitable. All learning is developmental. If you don't believe that, take out a piece of paper and draw a picture of your spouse, and everybody on this web chat can tell you at what age you stopped learning to draw. Speak a foreign language, play an instrument. It doesn't matter whether you're 8 or 80. You're not going to be good when you try something new. You've got to move through the failure cycle. Next, ESPN, believing incumbents set the pace at magnitude. When the Disney deal for ESPN was signed, the natural assumption was what was going to happen, whoever was the cable operator who had the most product on the was going to actually control what happened in the marketplace. But what happened was very different. And that was during the time in which they did this, something very interesting happened, which is people didn't want to buy complete packages. So the market began to disaggregate. And it wasn't the big players that started setting the pace. It was the exact opposite. It was niche players, players that no one had ever heard of, players that were almost bankrupt, like Netflix. It's easy to remember Netflix now, but I want you to go back to the late 90s and remember Netflix and what was happening in these organizations. So the cord cutters, the people who cannot compete on scope or scale, are inevitably going to be more radical innovators, because innovation to them isn't their best friend, it's their only friend. Next slide. So is your organization, do they believe that incumbents are going to set the pace? Do you believe that the biggest air force in the world, that the biggest fighting force in the world is actually going to set the terms of engagement? The biggest innovations come from the smallest players because they can't compete on scope or scale. Change your line of sight. You're looking the wrong direction. We're going to show this at the very end on how something very contemporary is getting solved because the big guys completely missed the line of sight. Next slide. Innovating from the inside out. Something interesting happened up the road from me here. In the early 1970s, we had an oil embargo. And our friends at General Motors started doing some real work into trying to create an alternative type of a vehicle. Those who are real technology wonks know that the first patents for electronic cars came around 1918. It's a really old idea. But what was interesting was General Motors put some real money into it until the 80s came around, and it was pretty clear that the oil embargo thing was over, that gas was going to become cheaper. But they had one small project that kind of hung on. They had a bunch of passionate people. And you can look this up. It was called the EV1. And it was introduced in the early 1990s. General Motors made about 3,000 of these cars. It completely then disavowed these cars, not because they didn't catch on, but because they did. It took the excess inventory that it had, it drove it into the desert in California, and it buried it. It's a perfect metaphor. Much of the technology that we see now on electronic vehicles were patents that elapsed from General Motors. It's not enough to invent it, because it wasn't the heart of what the organization did. It did everything in their power to basically distance itself from this technology. Next slide, please. So does your organization innovate from the inside out? The inside of the organization is basically designed to keep its equilibrium, to show that it's that's very consistent, to align things. But at the edges of the bell curve, risk and reward is reversed. I want you to think about, your friend who's an alcoholic. When you're an alcoholic, at the end of the bell curve, the risk of trying something radical like not drinking and the reward of staying where you're at is reversed, because otherwise you lose the family, you lose the business, so on and so forth. Don't believe it's true? Anybody remember what Apple was trading at? The first $1 trillion company in the world in 1997. It was trading at $2.97 a share. The Wall Street Journal proclaimed Apple is dead. When you're almost dead at the edge of the bell curve, you're likely to try something. So all the great ideas that we keep building bureaucracies on bureaucracies on bureaucracies are highly unlikely to produce anything significant. You either have to be on a roll. Elon Musk lost $750 million last quarter, right? But he's on a roll. So now we're going to get into neural nets, and the SpaceX thing worked, and now Tesla's starting to take off. Or you're in a crisis. Innovation doesn't move from the inside out. It moves from the outside in. Next slide. Sears. Oh, I got into this a few years ago with an editor at Forbes magazine who decided to say Alibaba is going to be to Amazon what Amazon was to Sears. And he went on to say, the problem with Sears is they just couldn't invent. Okay, old timers, everybody on this web chat. Anybody remember who got the email first? A company called CompuServe? Sears. Anybody remember who took commercial financial advisory and actually made it retail? So a company called Dean Witter? Sears. They had a baby called Morgan Stanley, and the guy who built this guy named Phil Purcell actually took it over. Anybody remember when commercial real estate became residential real estate, called Banker? Anybody remember the first card that had protection and gave you cash back, the Discover card? Anybody remember the first insurance company that bundled? Allstate? Anybody remember what eBay was called before eBay? It was called Prodigy. Sears got there first. You've got the story wrong. They had all the innovations, but they made the fundamental mistake. They tried to integrate the new into the old. They tried to take all the new stuff and make it go with the old Sears stuff, where everybody was passive aggressive and they just waited people out. Next slide. Does your organization integrate the new into the old? Integrate the old into the new, not the other way around, or the bureaucracy will subsume and subdue all forms of innovation. The road to hell is paved with the best intentions. How is it that you're going to make room for the new? Next slide. Now, recently there's been a documentary made about a company called General Magic. And those of us who spent a lot of our career early on in the early days of Silicon Valley, like I did, we remember General Magic really well. General Magic was what happened when Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple by John Sculley. And what happened was John Sculley and Apple could not innovate to save its life. In fact, their one big innovation, which they thought was going to be better than anything General Magic could do, was called Newton. And of course, it was famously a disaster. And the people who created the Newton created a little company called 3Com. The other people went off and created a whole bunch of companies that you know. Here's what's interesting about this. We get stuck in the startup mode. We fall in love with being really creative. But I go back to those early slides. It's all about, can you get to scale, right? If we're going to have a fighting force, these innovations have to be built. Supply chain has to work, right? That's what we're all dealing with right now, isn't it? What the fragility of our supply chain, how vertical our supply chain is. Next slide. So, is your organization stuck in the startup mode? Ideaholics. Oh, look at me, I got different hats on. Design thinking is the easiest part of the journey. I'm the last doctoral student of Rudolf Arnheim, the founder of the whole field, gave us the term visual thinking. The field was created by a man named Max Wertheimer in 1900 at the University of Berlin. Yes, design thinking is important. It's necessary, but certainly not anywhere near sufficient. Organizations need to make it. And when people go, we're going to do design thinking and making it, it gets a whole lot more complicated. Selling it doesn't fit according to all of this. And finally, scaling it and sustaining it. It's a whole different approach. Plan on things taking 3 times as much time, 3 times as much cost, and plan on the resistance going up 3 times. Next slide. Purdue, oh my God, the opioid problem. Ignoring disconfirming feedback. This is a real interesting one. This is the one I didn't work with. This is one of the companies I actually didn't work with. It's interesting because the company basically imploded, not because of all of the incredible damage they did to society, which is horrendous, but because of the internal memos that came out from the people who knew. This was like the Ford Escape, right? This was people who are doctors. I mean, we're going through this now with COVID, right? Doctors who are internally saying, this is potentially a highly addictive drug. It cannot be sold this way. It cannot be prescribed this way. And what happened was people who were not the experts made decisions. The key is know who knows. Know who knows. And Purdue ignored all the disconfirming feedback. They're doing everything they can to basically close the firm down because the legal ramifications of this are going to be insane. Great innovators don't look for confirming feedback. They look for disconfirming feedback. They try and escape their dominant logic. Does your organization ignore it? Listen to dissenters and look for signs that your course needs correcting, right? That's one of the biggest things. Next slide. Apple. Now, this is an organization I've been involved with really since the first time Steve Jobs was there. I was on a group called AIS, Applied Integrated Systems. And for young people, yes, there was a day before the internet. And what we worked on in the early days was something called AppleNet, because Microsoft was producing about 10 times more software than Apple could. So Apple basically created an internal network where they gave licenses to value-added resellers. They brought in venture capitalists. This is how Tom Perkins and Kleiner Perkins got associated with Apple. And basically, they created their own market. Sound familiar? Yes, this is the grandfather of iTunes. Now, what was interesting is when Apple was first built, their whole model was what was called Apple Fellows. It was like that movie Ratatouille. Anyone could cook, right? And the notion was what they're looking for is who emerges, right? And this is the early days of Johnny Ives, and this is Bill Atkinson, and so on and so forth. This is quite a group of people. And what happens is when Scully takes over, and then Al Lauren, and so on and so forth, Apple basically starts coming up with processes, and they build process after process after process. And what happens is we start getting committee platforms, beige machines that are unremarkable. Next slide, please. So does your organization try and make process over people? Now, this is really important to get because talent doesn't scale. If you believe talent scales, look at any 5-star restaurant who lose the chef. Look at any great ball team that won the World Series who had a star left-handed relief pitcher and it gets traded away. You pick it. You pick it. Talent matters. And it really bothers me when people talk about human resources or human capital. That, incidentally, the term human capital comes from a speech Lenin gave about what's called the Towering Heights. It's talent. It's people. You have to build your best processes to accommodate your best players. Anybody remember the difference when Westbrook ran the Chicago Bulls versus when Phil came in and ran the Chicago Bulls? He built the team around Michael Jordan, and all of a sudden they won 6 championships. They probably would have won more if he didn't play baseball and golf so much. Next slide. IBM. One of the problems IBM had for years is they had great players. Remember, IBM has produced, I think they're like number 40 on the institutions that have produced the most Nobel Prize winners. So they're in front of most of your universities, right? They've produced a lot of smart people. But I worked on a project when Paul Massano first came in and started building the solutions business. And the project was, they were getting stalled in trying to build solutions and trying to find out who actually had the expertise to solve the problem. They were trying to have a problem knowing who knows. So what we did was very simple. We took a universe of terms and we simply filtered the emails of these teams through these terms. And what we looked for, this is the beginning of network analysis, who was talking to whom. And when we began to figure out who the real experts were, what we did was we moved them up in the organization to make them in charge of the projects. And all of a sudden, these projects started coming in on time. They started coming in the right way. But the challenge, and particularly in microsegmenting, the microsegmenting world of social media, we don't know who knows. And we've got to know who knows. So we got to get those players in the right spot. And the Air Force has an abundance of incredibly talented people. But are they all in the right spots? Do you got the right players in the wrong positions? The people who run things in a predictable, controlled way are the very wrong people to encourage positive deviance, which is what innovation is. It's a form of positive deviance. So the very people who did a great job of getting everything in line are probably the worst people to be running this. Build diverse teams and places according to their abilities, not according to prearranged positions. You're putting the best team you can together. You're building the playbook around the players like Michael Jordan. You're not doing it the other way around. What else have we learned? United States Post Office. Has there ever been a time in your adult life where this thing hasn't been on the chopping block and a problem? I want you to go back and look at who's run the post office, right? If you wanted to have a modern post office, you'd be doing what? You'd be poaching somebody off of Amazon, or a logistics genius from FedExpress, or somebody from East Asia who basically built out the DHL network in Southeast Asia. You'd be doing something that picked an expert at how things move from here to there. But in fact, what they do is they continue to have executive appointees. And what these executive appointees is, they came up through the system, and inevitably they try and build tomorrow's organization with yesterday's leaders. It's the old people who built the old thing that they're putting in charge of the new thing. Next slide. Does your organization try to build tomorrow's organization with yesterday's leaders? Often the answer is not how you do something better, but rather who can do something new. Change the gene pool. Look at what all the big organizations are doing, from the Air Force to the University of Michigan. Their whole way of dealing with COVID is what? It's assuming that everything returns back to normal. It's the normal stuff. We're going to do it all, and you're going to sit in classroom, and you're going to behave, and you're all going to sit 6 feet away. No, you're not. And the only people who believe that are people who are not part of that milieu. Think about all, you could be using hotel rooms, you could be doing certifications, you could be hooking up in federation deals. There's a million things you could be doing right now, but you're not, because it's the old guys who are trying to do the new thing. It's not about how, it's about who. Next slide. So here are 10 things you can take away from this, but I want to give you a bit of hope here. Next slide. I want to talk about something that worked, and it's right in front of you. Under any scenario, doesn't matter what party you belong to, under any objective, measurable scenario, the United States government's response to COVID is a categorical failure. On every objective criteria, we are in last place in the world. For the greatest healthcare organization in the world, we ought to be insanely embarrassed by what's happened here. Again, it's not about parties. This is not about politics. This is about the facts of the case. But there's good news. The good news is, once it became clear that there was really no hierarchical structure that could deal with this, federations began to emerge. Now, I want to point out that federations are organic. They are asynchronous. They are natural. So, Oxford University has relationships with AstraZeneca, which has relationships to a couple dozen startups that they have a biotech equity position in. Michigan is Pfizer, Harvard is Moderna, so on and so forth. And what happened in a very short period of time is, organically, these groups began to form and compete against each other too. Capitalism requires capitalists. And what happened was, what usually takes, they say statistically, 10 years. It's actually about 8.5 years for vaccine development. They're now compressing that. They're saying 9 months. Don't believe 9. It's going to be more like 14 months. But vaccine development is going to be a fraction of the time. And what's different is the federal government didn't oversee this. In fact, these federations, because I was associated with one of them, actually came to the federal government and said, do you want to solve this? Give me $2 billion. It was the other way around, that the new basically co-opted the old. We're going to solve this problem because the wonderful thing about America is we have the ability to do this. But it's not the way in which we're pursuing innovation. It's not a bureaucracy upon a bureaucracy. It's actually getting innovation into the hands of those people who are positive deviants, who belong to what are called federations or creativity clusters, who know how to work together because they have a line of sight. So the downside is we fumbled the ball on our own 2-yard line. The good news is drug discovery will be completely different from here on out. In every category that I've talked about, I want you to think about how education is going to change after this. It doesn't matter what the incumbents want. I want you to think about how Coca-Cola is going to change after this. In distribution, I want you to think about what the automobile industry is going to do. Nothing is going to be the same because in all of these areas, these asynchronous networks are starting to emerge. And the reason is simple. When you're in a crisis, right? When you're in a crisis, innovation isn't your best friend, it's your only friend. And the only time that innovation really gets a foothold is when risk and reward are reversed. But you have to understand how innovation works. It moves from the outside in, it doesn't move from the inside out. Next slide, please. So, if you want to take the assessment that we built for the Air Force, that I see now a whole bunch of people are now required to take, feel free, it's free. You can take it. I've got it online here. And you should probably visit our booth if you're interested in seeing what we do with these big companies. What did we do with 258 of the Fortune 500 in developing their culture, their competency, their community? And we've got some real bright people. They're not me, some very bright. All the bright people are younger and better looking than me. And they'll talk you through that. So now what I want to do, because I've kind of pushed you around a little bit, I'm going to have Alicia pick some of these questions. She's going to ask them to the old man, and I'm going to do the best to see if I can answer them. We can take the share screen off now.
All right, perfect. Okay, so let's see. So we've had a couple, okay, Richard asked a question. In the product adoption life cycle, standards occur on the back half. So if we focus on standards only, the back half, how now do we integrate the new being introduced on the front half?
Yeah, great question. Who asked the question again?
Richard.
Richard, it's a great question. There's two ends to this. And that is, if you look at a continuum of innovation from the time you design to the time you optimize, at the beginning of the innovation process, you basically hedge. You have a funnel, lot to design. And the reason is there's very little downside. As you move towards manufacturability and supply chain, you have to optimize. So your choices get smaller. And the way you handle that is twofold. One, you put manufacturing people in the design suite. Now, it doesn't mean that they're the people you listen to more than anybody, but it means that their voice gets heard. And the reason is those design considerations designs have to take into consideration optimization. Let me give you a real example. On the early iPhones, I don't know if you know this, but there was talk about the contacts being made out of platinum. Well, one of the real questions was what? First of all, what would it cost to put platinum on your phone? Right? It'd be prohibitively expensive. It'd probably add $1,000 to it. And is there even enough rare earth on the planet to build it? Now, as you look at the cycle, now if people are familiar with my work, the innovation code or the competing values framework will know at the top of the model, you want to listen to more of the design thinkers. We call them the artists, the create point of view. But you want to create constructive conflict, positive conflict with the aft position, which we're going to call the controller engineering point of view. Because what's going to happen is they're going to create hybrids. Because it's not just innovation in the product or service, it's innovation in how you make it, right? And that's what great companies do. And nobody does it better right now than Apple, right? Which is annoying. Because some of the stuff like my little Mac Pro I've got here, there's a lot of design elements I don't like. But the notion is, think of this like a baseball game. The beginning pitcher is going to only throw maybe, 150 pitches, right? He's going to be good for 5 or 6 innings. But then you got to plan for the transition to the mid reliever. And the mid reliever is going to throw maybe 2 innings, 2.5 innings for you. Different kind of pitcher. different kind of role. And then you go to the closer. The closer, you know, if you can get an inning out of a closer, you're lucky. Closer's going to throw heat for an inning, right? That's the way you should deal with your innovation team. Not one size doesn't fit all, and you're platooning players. Also, good to note that if in fact there's no conflict in the design phase of your innovation, you're not doing it right. You've got to then, it's sort of like what the old Jesuits taught us. If everyone's aligned at the beginning, you have not considered everything that's going to happen downwind. And so you have to platoon people in. And some of the projects I've had in the Air Force, they've tried to do all these technological things at the front end of the funnel. That I bring in a lot of human factor stuff, and it really opens up how is it going to relate to when we get to scale and supply chain. I hope I addressed it. Next question.
Yes. All right. So Edie, I think, has a statement. Maybe you can elaborate on it. A lesson from the vaccine example is get out of the way. Had the FDA not streamlined regulations, pharma and universities could not succeed in the current environment. The same is true for innovation. Allow people to color outside the lines.
That's a great point, Edie. Of course, Edie's got a great insight here. She's a star pupil. I want to add to that, though. The only reason the FDA got out of the way was it was a crisis. And the one thing that people get wrong about America, America's not a policy-driven country. We're an event-driven country. We're very event-driven. So the good news is we're great innovators. And you think about it. When we're tested, we're not particularly smart. You know, when we look at the United Nations, we don't finish where we should finish. But what we're really good at is when it's a crisis, we're very good at these organic networks starting to show up. And what happened was, I think what happened was these federations went to the Fed and said, we can answer this, but you got to lower the gate. And they did.
All right, so we have a couple other questions. Bill Inman asked, how do you convince yesterday's leaders, in quotes, to get out of the way of the innovators?
Yeah, the one thing I do, I was talking to somebody today at the Pentagon, a very interesting conversation today. And it was like talking to a kindred soul. And the way I like to do this is I never attack the middle directly. What I try and do is I try and show proof of concept where it's visible, but just at the horizon. So if somebody's trying to do something internally, I try and put together a team that's both internal and external, and I try and build a proof of concept very quickly so that my advantage is I get out of the blocks fast. And then what I do is once I've done that, everybody sees it. So let me give you a real example of something that I did early in my career. Some of you don't know, I'm one of the architects that built Domino's Pizza. When I got to the company, it was $20 million. When I left, it was $5 billion. That's how I met Mitt Romney, sold the company Bain Capital, right? So what I used to do was twofold. The first problem I had was I had to get in to these areas where, you know, delivery was going to be a big thing, but I had to be faster than Pizza Hut, which was owned by PepsiCo, all the Harvard guys. So what I did was we developed this thing called equipment and supply, and we would go in and we would basically buy out strip malls. We'd put equipment and supply in 2 weeks. We'd outfit a store in 2 weeks, right? And the object was we would very quickly go into an area and we try and figure out what worked and what didn't. And the tip of our spear never worked, never. But we planned on it. So we didn't buy the expensive stuff. We went cheap the first thing, figured out where people were, what they were likely to do. And then what we would do is once we knew where everyone was, we would come in and we would buy those strip malls and we'd build in earnest, which take us about 3 weeks, an extra week. And what would happen is that all of the kind of conventional people, the pizza people, realized that there were going to be another 9-10 months and we had to basically lock up the market. I would do the same thing with these franchisees who are also internal. So this is your internal argument, who basically didn't like anything I ever said. You know, people like that. You didn't come up, whatever. You know, I'm making you a lot of money and you're complaining on me. So what I would do is every year I would build 3 stores that were radically different. And I'd build them in weird places like Zanesville, Ohio. And not that it's weird, but Lake of the Ozarks and places that you wouldn't normally think to look. And I'd game the system. I'd put my best people in there. And I'd very quickly try and figure out what people liked and didn't like. And what would happen is I'd almost inevitably close all of them. But what I was doing is very quickly I was learning, and then I would build a prototype store. And this is the part that's going to seem weird to you. I would tell the biggest franchisees that they couldn't have the cool new store because I'd only give it to people who are really innovators. And the cool new stores would start killing in store sales. And so what happened was then the incumbents would say, can I get in? Can I get in? And I was really a jerk about it. No, you can't. No, not for you. You're already big. You know everything. And eventually they do it. In fact, in our joint venture with Haworth, that's what the Innovatrium was. The Innovatrium was showing the University of Michigan how to build an innovation community. Once it got built and that became the center of sort of, I don't know if you know this, Ann Arbor has more venture capital per person than any city in the country right now. It's a small town, right? So once it becomes the epicenter, what's the bigger school do? It comes in and says, here's our $100 million building. And my friends are like, how do you feel about that? I'm like, we won. We won. What we did was we stood at the border, we showed the proof of concept, we brought Mama over because we're not competing with Mama. We're trying to do the creative work the organization can't. That's the difference. We're not here to embarrass Mama. We love Mama, right? This is our country. This is our military. This is what we need to do. But sometimes we need a little help. You got time for one more?
Yep. Do you have any recommendations for the mid-level or low-level managers that are trying to function within some of the cumbersome bureaucracy while they do not have the ability to make sweeping impacts or decisions?
I do. I have two of them. One, look up and look down. Now, I want to tell you something that the Air Force says in a snarky way that I don't like. You talk about the middle of your organization as the thermofrost layer or some snarky thing. The middle of every organization is designed to maintain its equilibrium. There's nothing wrong with it. The parts of any organization at scale that will change is the top. I spent a lot of time at your Pentagon. The top of the Pentagon is very interested in change. Why? Because just like a CEO who's getting paid on options, they have to look at the horizon. They've read all the strategy reports. They know what awaits them. Shakespeare, something wicked this way comes. The bottom of the pyramid are people who are far away from headquarters who have to figure this crap out. And they're highly imaginative. And boy, I love the Air Force. Your airmen are amazing. What you need to do is you need to look up and make sure that you're aligning what you do with your sugar daddy or sugar mama. And you need to look down to the airmen who are having challenges and try and proof the concept there. So you have to be the synchronization tissue. And yes, you're going to get pushback. You will always get pushback. Great innovators never take credit for their own work. They give other people credit. I call them creativizers, right? They give other people credit. Now, final thing about creativizers. Everybody in their life does things that are creative, and everybody has some span or domain of control. It may be as simple as how you order paper or how you drive to work or where people can eat. But if you don't start exercising small bits of control, you don't know where the boundaries really are. And the Air Force and any organization that's very large can't micromanage everything. So what you're really trying to do is feel your way to the boundary. Now, don't get me wrong. Everybody knows the boundary. I know the boundaries. Michigan, I know the boundaries. I know where I get my hand slapped. And I also know if I take 2 steps farther, I lose my head, right? I know where that is. But everything between here and there is people just whining. That's territory that you need to take. And I tell this to junior professors all the time. They say, well, how do you get to do all the things you get to do? I said, because I've been doing this for 30 some years. And for 30 some years, every year, it's like football. I'm gaining 10 yards. I'm trying to take 10 yards. And what you learn every time you take 10 yards is you gain competencies and most importantly, you gain credibility. This is my big issue with the whole field of innovation. You know, about 25 professors created the field. I'm kind of the youngest guy of the whole group that created it. I'm the baby of the group and I'm the old guy, right? But what's interesting is there's a lot of people who write about, think about the internet. Think about how many people write on the internet now about virology who sat next to you in biology class and couldn't pass it. But all of a sudden they know how to deal with COVID. I mean, come on, they're dumb as dirt, right? The big problem when it comes to innovation is you've got to actually do it. It's tradecraft. You know, it's like anything. You've got to actually learn how to do the thing. And then once you learn how to do the thing, you can improvise and do better things with it. But I'm very worried that I came up in a world where I was apprenticed. I was very much apprenticed by people who were not particularly, they weren't always nice. We'll leave it like that, you know. But I learned the craft. I'm worried that for our young people, we don't have enough places where we're willing to be an authority figure and apprentice them. And I worry that America, our sense of destiny is completely hinging on young people having this ability. They have the ability. We have not done a good job. This is not on them, it's on me. We have not done a good job at apprenticing these young people to take the disciplined risk that's required and have taken the deviant behavior that's required bit by bit to develop the real skills to do this. But we have to now.
Well, that ends our time. Thank you so much, Dr. Degraff. This was an enlightening conversation. There are tons of other questions. I guess if you want to get in touch with Dr. Degraff, we have his information. Go
to the booth. Go to the Innovatrium booth.
Yes.
Got people who answer your question right now. Go to the booth. We also got Hayworth people there. They've got super smart people. We got military people there, Air Force people who are full of answers, not just the old guy.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, everyone. And go back.
Happen. We really need you guys to succeed. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.